A mother sells her own daughter, a fat, gentle virgin, to a stranger for a pouch of gold and a jug of whiskey. The crowd laughs, thinking it's a trade between sinners. But as the stranger leads the girl into the cold mountain night, whispers ripple through town. Because that man isn't just any drifter. He's the most feared mountain man in the Rockies. Everyone says he's killed more men than winter itself. Yet instead of cruelty, he offers her food, warmth, and a place by his fire. Still, in his cabin, she finds something buried, a blood-stained army badge, and the truth might be deadlier than the rumors. As soldiers close in and the past comes roaring back, mercy and justice collide in the snow. What happens when the woman the world called worthless becomes the only one brave enough to save the man everyone feared? And when sin and salvation share the same roof, who will God forgive first? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The setting sun painted long shadows across the dusty streets of the San Juan mining town. Hallie Brinker's arms ached from hauling the heavy water bucket, her calloused hands raw from the rope handle. The bucket swayed with each step, precious drops splashing onto her worn boots. She paused to catch her breath, watching the miners trudge home from their endless pursuit of silver and gold in the mountain's stubborn veins. The familiar sounds of breaking glass and drunken laughter spilled from the saloon's grimy windows. Hallie's heart sank when she spotted her mother through the wavering lamplight, already deep in her cups despite the early hour. A stranger in a threadbare duster sat across from her, his broad shoulders hunched as if carrying an invisible weight. "Hallie!" Her mother's sharp voice cut through the evening air. "Get in here, girl!" Setting down the water bucket carefully, Hallie smoothed her faded calico skirt and stepped into the saloon. The smell of stale whiskey and unwashed bodies made her stomach turn. A few regulars nodded as she passed, their eyes holding a mixture of pity and resignation. The back room was lit by a single oil lamp, its yellow light catching the silver threads in the stranger's dark hair. Up close, Hallie could see the scars on his weathered hands as he placed a leather pouch on the rough wooden table. "This here's Elliot Crane," her mother announced, words slurring slightly. "He's offered good trade for you." The words hit Hallie like a physical blow. She'd heard whispers about Elliot Crane, the former cavalry scout they called the Butcher of Cimarron Pass. But the man before her didn't match the fearsome tales. His eyes were gentle when they met hers, filled with something that might have been understanding. "A fat girl like you eats more than you're worth," her mother continued, reaching for the jug of corn liquor Crane had placed beside the gold. "Dust. Might as well get something useful in trade." Hallie's cheeks burned at the familiar insult, but she kept her spine straight. She'd long since learned that tears only fed her mother's cruel streak. Crane rose slowly, his movements careful as if approaching a spooked horse. "Miss Brinker," he said softly, "I know this ain't what you planned for your life, but I give you my word, no harm will come to you in my care." His voice was deep but quiet, like distant thunder over the mountains. Hallie found herself studying his face, searching for signs of the monster from the stories. Instead, she saw lines of sorrow etched around his eyes and mouth. "Best get moving before full dark," he said, gathering his hat. "My horse is out front." Hallie didn't look back at her mother, who was already tipping the jug to her lips. She followed Crane outside, where a sturdy bay horse stood beside a laden pack mule. The horse nickered softly as Crane approached, pushing its velvet nose against his chest. "This is Buck," he said, patting the horse's neck. "And that ornery fellow is Moses." He nodded toward the mule, who flicked his ears in response. From his saddlebag, Crane pulled out a thick wool blanket, shaking it out before wrapping it around Hallie's shoulders. The wool was soft against her skin, smelling of pine needles and wood smoke. He then broke a biscuit in half, offering her the larger portion. "We'll only ride as far as the creek line tonight," he explained, helping her mount behind the saddle. "Too dangerous to travel these paths in the dark." The bay's steady gait carried them away from town, each step taking Hallie further from the only life she'd known. Though her hands trembled where they gripped the saddle's cantle, an unexpected sense of relief washed over her. The weight of her mother's disappointment, the daily reminders of her worthlessness, they seemed to grow lighter with each hoofbeat. Crane led them to a sheltered spot near the creek, where the sound of running water mixed with the distant barking of town dogs. He worked efficiently, gathering stones to build a small fire pit while Hallie stood uncertain, clutching the blanket around her shoulders. "Best build it behind these rocks," he murmured, striking his flint. "No need to advertise our presence to any curious eyes." The flames caught quickly, throwing dancing shadows on the rock face behind them. Crane moved with practiced ease, setting up a simple camp and brewing coffee in a battered tin pot. When he handed Hallie a steaming cup, their fingers brushed briefly. "I reckon you've heard stories about me," he said finally, settling cross-legged on his bedroll. "Some true, some not. But I want you to know something." He paused, staring into the fire. "Whatever happens from here on out, that's between us and the good Lord. We'll see what he meant for us, in his own time." Hallie wrapped her hands around the warm cup, watching the town's lanterns grow dim in the distance. The night air carried the scent of sage and juniper, clean and sharp after years of coal smoke and unwashed bodies. Though uncertainty gnawed at her belly, she felt strangely unburdened, as if she'd been carrying a heavy load for so long she'd forgotten what it was like to set it down. The fire crackled softly as Crane pulled out his Bible, its leather cover worn smooth by years of handling. His scarred fingers moved gently across the pages, finding a familiar passage. When he began to read, his voice was low and steady, like the creek's endless song. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Hallie listened to the ancient words of comfort, watching sparks rise toward the emerging stars. The man beside her might carry the weight of dark deeds, but his hands had offered only kindness. Perhaps, she thought, God's mercy could work through the most unexpected vessels. The town dogs' barking grew fainter as night settled fully around their small camp. Crane added another small branch to the fire, careful to keep the flames low. "Try to get some rest," he said quietly. "Tomorrow's path will be long, but it leads to better things." Hallie nodded, pulling the wool blanket tighter. The scent of pine needles followed her into uneasy dreams, where she walked through endless mountain meadows, finally free of the burden of being found wanting. In her sleep, she heard her mother's bitter words fade like mist in morning sun, replaced by the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the promise of sanctuary. The fire burned low, casting just enough light to keep the darkness at bay. Crane sat watch, his Bible open on his knee, a guardian against both physical threats and the shadows of the past. His scarred hands, once instruments of violence, now turned pages with reverent care, a reminder that even the most feared among men could choose a different path. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, a lonely sound that echoed off the canyon walls. But here, in this small circle of firelight, two wounded souls had found an unexpected moment of peace. Whatever tomorrow might bring, they faced it with the strange comfort of shared isolation and the hope that redemption might wear many faces. The night deepened around them, stars wheeling overhead in their ancient patterns. The creek continued its endless journey downward, its voice a constant reminder that all things, even pain, must eventually flow toward something larger than themselves. In this moment, between what was and what would be, Hallie felt the first tentative stirrings of hope. Not the desperate kind she'd known in town, but something quieter and more substantial, like the solid ground beneath her feet. The sale of a human life in a dreary mining town had somehow become a door to possibility, though neither buyer nor bought could yet see where the path might lead. For now, it was enough that the path existed at all, winding away from darkness toward the promise of dawn. The creek whispered through, the pre-dawn darkness, its voice muffled by tendrils of mist that crept along the water like ghostly fingers. Elliot Crane moved with quiet efficiency, stoking the banked coals of their fire until flames licked upward, casting warm light against the rocks. The metal spoon clinked softly against the pot as he stirred oatmeal, the familiar scent of coffee mingling with wood smoke. Hallie sat wrapped in her wool blanket, watching his methodical movements. His scarred hands measured coffee grounds with care, as if even this simple task deserved full attention. "Best eat while it's hot," he said, passing her a tin cup of oatmeal. "We've got some miles ahead." Hallie accepted the cup, grateful for its warmth against her cold fingers. "Where are we heading?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot settled back on his heels, pouring coffee into 2 battered cups. "We'll follow the mule trail north a spell," he explained, "then cut into the timber. Fewer curious eyes up there." He passed her a cup of coffee, steam rising in the cool air. Safer that way. The oatmeal was plain but filling, seasoned with just a pinch of salt. Hallie watched as Elliot began breaking camp, his movements precise and practiced. He approached Buck, the bay horse, with a side saddle in his arms. "This'll be easier on your legs," he said, securing the saddle with careful hands. "No sense making the journey harder than need be." As he worked, Elliot checked his weapons with the same methodical attention. He drew a single-action Colt from its holster, explaining as he worked. "It's not like them Army repeaters," he said, demonstrating the action. "Fires once, then needs loading. Simple but reliable if you treat it right." The sun was just beginning to paint the eastern sky when they set out. Moses, the pack mule, followed behind Buck with steady steps, bells jingling softly with each movement. Elliot led them along the creek, setting an unhurried pace that showed consideration for Hallie's inexperience. Despite the side saddle's help, Hallie's knees began to ache as the morning wore on. She didn't complain, but Elliot seemed to sense her discomfort, calling for brief rests when the terrain allowed. Each time, he offered water from his canteen and checked the saddle's fit with gentle hands. By mid-morning, they reached a shallow branch of the creek. Water burbled over smooth stones, the crossing no deeper than Buck's knees. Still, Elliot dismounted, moving to walk beside the horse. "Current's gentle," he said, one hand on Buck's bridle, "but no sense taking chances." His presence beside them was steady and reassuring as they crossed, water swirling around his boots. When the sun reached its peak, they stopped in a small clearing. Elliot helped Hallie down from the saddle, her legs trembling from the unfamiliar exercise. He spread his coat on a fallen log to make a seat for her, then pulled jerky and dried apples from his saddlebags. "Not fancy," he said, sharing out the simple meal. "But it'll keep us going." As they ate, Elliot pulled his worn Bible from his saddlebag. The leather cover was smooth from years of handling, the pages well thumbed but treated with obvious care. He opened to the Psalms, his finger tracing the familiar words. "My ma always said scripture sits better when shared," he said quietly. Then, line by line, he began teaching her the 23rd Psalm. His voice was patient, asking nothing in return as Hallie stumbled over the words, then gained confidence with each repetition. "The Lord is my shepherd," she repeated after him, the ancient words bringing unexpected comfort. "I shall not want," he continued, his deep voice gentle. They worked through the psalm slowly, the words mixing with the sound of wind in the pines and the occasional stamp of hooves as the horses grazed nearby. Elliot never rushed or corrected, simply offering each line again when needed. The afternoon brought changes to the air. The wind shifted, carrying a sharp chill that spoke of snow. Soon enough, small flakes began to drift down, catching in Hallie's hair and melting on Buck's dark coat. Elliot studied the sky with knowing eyes. "Storm's coming in faster than I figured," he said, helping Hallie back into the saddle. "Cabin's still a fair piece ahead. Best we find shelter and wait it out." They rode on as the snow fell thicker, Elliot leading them toward a rise of granite that thrust up from the forest floor. The overhang created a natural shelter, its walls blocking the worst of the wind. "This'll do," Elliot said, helping Hallie down. He moved with practiced efficiency, tethering Buck and Moses where they'd be protected from the wind. Then he began gathering pine boughs, showing Hallie how to weave them together to create a windbreak. "Learned this from an old mountain man," he explained as they worked. "Pine keeps more heat than you'd expect." The methodical way he approached each task reminded Hallie of stories she'd heard about soldiers. Everything in its proper order, no movement wasted. It made her wonder about the rumors that had followed him to their mining town, the whispered tales that seemed at odds with the gentle man before her. As darkness approached, they sat beneath the overhang, sharing the last of their jerky. The conversation turned to simple things: their ages, where they'd grown up, the high price of oats this past winter. Elliot's answers were honest but careful, like a man used to measuring his words. "I'm 38 next month," he said, adding wood to their small fire. "Been in these mountains going on 5 years now." "I'm 23, Hallie offered quietly, "though Mama always said I looked older." Elliot nodded, his face thoughtful in the firelight. "Age is just numbers," he said. "It's what you do with your days that matters." The snow continued falling outside their shelter, but within the windbreak of pine boughs, they remained relatively warm. Elliot had positioned everything with clear purpose: the horses where they'd block some wind, the fire where its smoke would rise through a gap in the rock, their bedrolls close enough to the flames for warmth, but not danger. Each small act of consideration, the adjusted pace, the steady hand beside the creek, the shared psalm, had slowly transformed Elliot from the fearsome figure of rumor into something else. He was still the man who had purchased her freedom with gold dust and whiskey, but his actions spoke of protection rather than possession. As the evening deepened, Hallie watched him check the horses one last time, adjust the pine boughs, and settle back against his saddle. His movements were those of a man accustomed to caring for others, though everything she'd heard suggested he lived alone in the mountains. The fire crackled softly, casting warm light against the granite walls of their shelter. Outside, the snow continued its silent dance. But here, in this small space carved from the wilderness, Hallie felt an unexpected sense of security. Whatever darkness lay in Elliot Crane's past, his present actions spoke of a man dedicated to keeping her safe on this journey into unknown territory. The day's travels had shown her a different kind of strength than she'd known before. Not the harsh power her mother wielded with words and fists, but the quiet force of someone who chose to use his capabilities for protection rather than harm. Each careful preparation, each considered action, built a foundation of trust more solid than any hurried promises could have achieved. Morning brought a wan sun that painted the snow-draped forest in shades of pearl. The storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that muffled their horses' hoofbeats. Elliot led them along a winding path that seemed to disappear into the wilderness itself, though his confident guidance suggested intimate familiarity with every twist and turn. "Not far now," he said, his breath clouding in the crisp air. "Cabin's just past that ridge ahead." They climbed steadily, the horses' flanks steaming with effort. At last they crested a small rise, and there it stood, Elliot's home, tucked into a natural fold of the land. The cabin was built of notched logs, tight-fitted and chinked with mud and moss. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, evidence that the banked fire within still lived. Near the cabin, a frozen seep created a small, ice-rimmed pool. A well-built spring house stood nearby, its log walls protecting stored food from both weather and wildlife. To one side, Hallie could see the slanted doors of a root cellar dug into the hillside. What caught her eye most prominently was the meat pole, a sturdy beam stretched between two trees where several cleaned rabbits hung alongside a small deer. The sight of such plenty made her stomach tighten with hope. She'd known too many winters of scarce portions. Elliot dismounted first, then reached up to help Hallie from her saddle. His hands were strong but careful as he lifted her down, setting her gently on her feet in the snow. Her legs trembled from 2 days of riding, and she steadied herself against Buck's warm flank. "Let me show you around before we settle in," Elliot said, leading the way to the spring house. Inside, shelves lined the walls, holding crocks of preserved foods and a small butter churn. The air was cool and sweet with the scent of apples. "Water from the seep keeps things fresh," he explained, pointing to where the spring's flow had been cleverly directed through a channel in the floor. "Even in summer, it stays cool enough for milk and butter." The root cellar revealed more bounty: sacks of potatoes and carrots, strings of dried onions, and bins of apples. Elliot had clearly prepared well for the winter months, though Hallie noticed everything was portioned for one person's needs. Finally, they entered the cabin itself. The single room was tidy, but spoke of solitude. A narrow bed, neatly made with a patchwork quilt, stood against one wall. Near the stone hearth, a worn Bible lay on a small table, its pages marked with a leather strip. Beneath the room's single window, a heavy wooden chest sat locked and silent, its purpose unknown. Elliot moved to stoke the fire, adding fresh logs from the stack beside the hearth. "The bed's yours," he said matter-of-factly. "I'll make do fine with my buffalo robe by the fire." Hallie started to protest, but he shook his head. "Won't hear otherwise. My ma would rise from her grave and tan my hide if I let a woman sleep on the floor." He set about preparing their evening meal with the same efficiency he'd shown on the trail. Soon, a hearty stew bubbled in the iron pot, and the smell of fresh cornbread filled the cabin. The simple domesticity of the scene slowly eased the tension from Hallie's shoulders. As they ate, she found herself humming softly, an old hymn her grandmother had sung years ago. The sound surprised her. She couldn't remember the last time she'd felt safe enough to make music. The tune died in her throat when she realized what she was doing. Elliot stood at a small tin mirror hung by the window, working his straight razor over his jaw. At her sudden silence, he paused, his face set in an unreadable expression. Something in his stillness made Hallie wonder what memories her hymn had stirred. After their meal, Elliot went out to bring in more firewood. Hallie took the opportunity to begin setting the cabin to rights, finding comfort in the familiar motions of domesticity. She was sweeping near the wood box when she noticed something unusual. A scrap of blue cloth snagged in the log pile Elliot had just carried in. Her hands slowed on the broom handle, as she considered the cloth's meaning. Before she could think too deeply about it, her broom dislodged something else from behind the wood box. A metal insignia, its surface dark with what looked like dried blood. Even with limited education, Hallie recognized the marks of the United States Cavalry. Her heart beat faster as she picked up the insignia. Stories of the cavalry's actions in these mountains had reached even her small mining town. Some told of protection and justice, others of darker deeds. Which tale did this bloodied piece of metal represent? The cabin door creaked open as Elliot returned with another armload of wood. He stopped short when he saw what she held, his face going still as mountain stone. The silence stretched between them, broken only by the soft pop of burning logs in the fireplace. Finally, Elliot spoke, his voice low and careful. "There's things in my past that need explaining," he said. "But I ask you not to judge what you don't yet understand." Hallie looked down at the insignia in her hand, then back at the man who had shown her nothing but consideration since purchasing her freedom. The weight of unspoken history hung in the air between them. "I reckon we all have things that need explaining," she said softly, setting the insignia on the table beside his Bible. Elliot nodded once, sharply, and began stacking the wood he'd brought in. Neither spoke again as evening settled fully around the cabin. The wind found its way through the chinking between the logs, its whispered voice filling the silence with questions yet to be answered. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls as Hallie prepared for sleep in the borrowed bed. Across the room, Elliot arranged his buffalo robe near the hearth, his movements speaking of long practice. The bloodied insignia lay where she'd placed it, a silent reminder that even in this peaceful cabin, the past was never far away. Each creak of the settling logs, each whisper of wind through the chinking, seemed to echo with untold stories. Hallie pulled the patchwork quilt up to her chin, watching the firelight play across the ceiling. Whatever darkness lay in Elliot's past with the cavalry, she had seen enough of his present nature to know that snap judgments would serve neither of them well. Sleep came slowly that night, accompanied by the sound of wind in the chinks and the quiet breathing of two people, each carrying their own burdens of history, sharing space but separated by the weight of unspoken truths. Dawn crept over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, Hallie woke to the sound of Elliot stoking the fire. The morning chill had settled deep into the corners of the room, making her grateful for the thick patchwork quilt. "Morning," Elliot said quietly, setting a pot of coffee on the newly awakened flames. "Thought we might get you settled with some tasks today. Nothing too taxing while you're still getting your bearings." Hallie nodded, pushing back the quilt and reaching for her shawl. The wooden floor was cold beneath her feet as she moved to help with breakfast preparations. They worked in comfortable silence, Elliot frying salt pork, while Hallie mixed cornmeal mush in a cast-iron pot. After they'd eaten, Elliot brought out a basket of dried beans and a pile of socks in need of mending. "These'll keep you occupied while I'm outside," he said, setting them on the small table near the window. "You can watch the valley from here while you work." The beans made a soft rattling sound as Hallie sorted through them, removing any stones or damaged ones before starting to shell them. Sunlight streamed through the window, warming her hands as she worked. From her seat she could see Elliot in the yard, his broad shoulders swinging in a steady rhythm as he split kindling. The familiar tasks brought a sense of normalcy to this strange new situation. Her fingers moved automatically through the beans, muscle memory from years of similar work taking over. When she finished with one handful, she'd reach for another, all while watching Elliot through the window glass. He stayed within sight of the cabin as he worked, something she suspected was intentional. After stacking the split wood, he checked his trap line, following a careful path through the surrounding timber. His movements were deliberate, always keeping the cabin in view. The morning passed quietly until Elliot returned from checking his last trap. He carried 2 plump snowshoe hares, their white winter fur stained with red where the traps had done their work. But Hallie's eyes fixed on his shoulder, where his shirt was torn and darkened with blood. "Branch caught me unawares," he explained, setting down the hares. "Nothing serious." "Let me tend it," Hallie said, already moving to the hearth where a pot of water was kept warm. Her voice was steadier than she felt. "Need to clean it proper?" Elliot studied her face for a moment, then nodded. He sat on a stool while Hallie gathered what she needed: clean cloth, soap, and the tin of healing salve she'd spotted earlier on a shelf. She boiled fresh cloth strips in the pot of water, then let them cool enough to handle. Her hands remained steady as she cleaned the wound, though her heart beat faster at this intimate task. The cut wasn't deep, but it was long enough to need attention. "You've done this before," Elliot observed as she worked. "Had to learn," she replied softly. "Ma weren't one for tending hurts." He stayed silent after that, letting her finish her work. The bandage, when she was done, was neat and secure. Her fingers lingered for just a moment on his shoulder before she stepped back, gathering up the soiled cloths. As the sun climbed toward noon, Hallie set about preparing their midday meal. She used some of the beans she'd shelled earlier, adding them to a stew with dried vegetables from the root cellar. The familiar task helped settle her nerves, still humming from the morning's careful intimacy of wound tending. They ate at the small table, steam rising from their bowls. Halfway through the meal, Elliot set down his spoon, his face serious. "There's something you should know," he said, his voice low and careful. "Men from town sometimes ride these timber lines, looking for me." He paused, meeting her eyes. "That's why I keep watch after dark. Need you to understand that." Hallie's spoon stopped halfway to her mouth. She set it down slowly, processing his words. "Because of what happened? With the cavalry?" "Partly that, partly other things." He looked down at his bowl. "Can't say more just yet. But you need to know to be careful. Stay close to the cabin. Pay attention to sounds that don't belong." She nodded, understanding growing in her chest. This wasn't just about 2 people finding their way through an arranged situation. There were darker currents running beneath their daily routine. The afternoon passed in quiet industry. Hallie finished mending the socks, while Elliot cleaned the hares and hung them in the meat house. The sun was setting when they heard it, the distant toll of a church bell, its sound carried clear and sweet on the winter air. "Wednesday prayer meeting," Elliot said, cocking his head to listen. "Must be. Town's about 10 miles off, but sound carries far in these hills." Hallie's hands stilled in her lap. The bell's tone brought back memories of standing outside the church in town, watching well-dressed families file in while her mother pulled her away, muttering about hypocrites. She'd never been welcomed in those pews, never felt the comfort of community worship. As if reading her thoughts, Elliot reached for his Bible. The leather was soft with use, the pages well thumbed. He opened it carefully, finding his place with practiced ease. "Mind if I read?" he asked. When she shook her head, he began in a quiet, steady voice. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." The words washed over Hallie like warm water. She closed her eyes, letting them sink in. Here, in this cabin with this careful man, the verses felt different than they had outside church walls. They felt real, immediate. "Many are the afflictions of the righteous," Elliot continued, "but the Lord delivereth him out of them all." Hallie found herself whispering the words after him, letting them take root in her heart. Each verse seemed chosen with purpose, speaking of God's care for the lowly, his attention to the overlooked. When the reading was done, they prepared for night. The fire was banked, the shutters checked, water brought in from the spring. Elliot wrapped his buffalo robe around his shoulders and checked his colt before stepping outside. "Get some rest," he said from the doorway. "I'll keep first watch." Hallie nodded, pulling her quilt up to her chin in the narrow bed. Through the cabin's walls, she could hear the soft crunch of Elliot's boots in the snow as he made his rounds. The sound was both comforting and unsettling. Protection and danger wrapped together in the night air. She drifted toward sleep, her mind full of the day's events. The simple work of beans and mending, the careful tending of Elliot's wound, the warning of danger, and the comfort of Scripture. The sound of his footsteps continued, steady and watchful, as she slipped into dreams. Each crunch of snow marked another circuit around the cabin, a circle of protection drawn again and again in the darkness. Hallie's last conscious thought was a strange mix of gratitude and concern. Grateful for the safety of these walls and this watchful man, concerned for what threats might be moving through the timber, seeking them out. The night settled deep around the cabin, broken only by the soft sound of boots in snow and the occasional distant cry of a winter-hunting owl. Dawn brought a pearl-gray sky and fresh snow dusting the pines. Hallie had just finished laying kindling in the hearth when a voice called from the clearing. "Ho there, Elliot! It's old Thad. Come bearing news." Through the cabin's small window, she saw a grizzled figure shambling through the snow. His beard was more ice than hair, and his buckskins were worn smooth at the knees and elbows. He carried a cloth-wrapped bundle and what looked like a string of smoked fish. Elliot appeared from the woodpile, shoulders relaxing at the sight of the visitor. "Thad Jessup," he called back. "You're abroad early." The old trapper stamped snow from his boots on the porch. "Figured you'd have coffee on, and I reckon the lady might appreciate some company besides your brooding self." His eyes crinkled kindly at Hallie through the window. Elliot ushered him inside, where the morning fire was just catching. "Hallie," he said, "this here's Thad Jessup. Known him since my first winter in these hills. Thad, Miss Hallie Brinker." "Ma'am." Thad doffed his fur cap, revealing steel-gray hair that stuck up like porcupine quills. "Much obliged for the warmth of your hearth." Hallie nodded shyly, already moving to set the coffee pot closer to the flames. Her mother's sharp voice echoed in her memory. Never waste good coffee on trappers, but she pushed it aside. This was her hearth now, such as it was. "Brought you some sugar maple candy," Thad said, unwrapping his bundle. "And some smoke-cured trout. River's been good to me this season." They settled around the small table, steam rising from tin cups. Thad's weathered hands cupped his coffee like it was precious gold. His eyes, sharp despite his apparent age, moved between Elliot and Hallie with quiet assessment. "Reckon you didn't ride up here just to share fish," Elliot said finally. Thad sipped his coffee before answering. "No, I surely didn't." He glanced at Hallie, then back to Elliot. "Had some visitors down to the livery yesterday. Army men, asking questions." Elliot's hand tightened on his cup. "What kind of questions?" "They're looking for someone. Called him the Butcher of Cimarron Pass." Thad's voice was gentle, but the words fell heavy in the cabin's quiet. Hallie's breath caught. She'd heard whispers of that name in town, mothers pulling children closer when it was spoken. She looked at Elliot, saw how still he'd become. Thad turned to Hallie, his kind eyes serious. "Listen here, miss. Something you ought to understand about these parts. A man's reputation often hides someone else's sin, like a snowdrift covering a hollow, if you take my meaning. Elliot stood abruptly. Need to check the stock. He strode out, letting in a blast of cold air. As soon as the door closed, Thad leaned forward, his voice dropping low. Girl, you need to know the truth of it. That name they gave him, it's backward as a mirror image. Hallie set down her cup, listening intently. It was 2 winters back, Thad continued. Bad year for everyone, especially the Ute people. Their winter stores had been burned in a raid, against all treaties. Some of their children were trying to gather spilled grain near the Cimarron Pass military post. He paused, checking the window where Elliot was visible among the horses. There was a sergeant there, deep in his cups and spoiling for blood. Had his rifle aimed at those starving children. Elliot was scout there then. He saw what was coming, and did what any God-fearing man would do. He shot that sergeant dead before he could murder those innocents. Hallie's hand flew to her mouth. But then why? The captain there. He'd given unlawful orders about keeping Indians away from army stores, even if it meant shooting children. When word of the killing got out, he blamed Elliot, called him a butcher to hide his own black heart. Thad's voice was heavy with old anger. Elliot took the blame and ran rather than name names. Figured it was better to be thought a killer than stay and watch more children die. The door creaked open, and Elliot stepped back in, his jaw tight. He'd heard enough to know what Thad had shared. Didn't want you learning it this way, Hallie. She looked at him with new understanding. The careful way he treated her, his gentle hands, his nightly watches, all of it clicked into place like a key in a lock. I'm glad I know, she said softly. Thad cleared his throat. There's more news needs telling. Fresh Army patrol crossed south yesterday. Best avoid the ridge trail for at least a week. Elliot nodded, the muscle in his cheek jumping. Much obliged for the warning. They finished their coffee in companionable quiet. Thad shared news of fur prices and which streams were still running under the ice. He had a gift for easy conversation that filled the space without pressing on tender spots. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Thad rose to leave. Best be getting on before dusk catches me. These old eyes ain't what they used to be for night trailing. He left them with the promised trout and maple candy, plus a small bag of coffee beans he'd traded for. At the door, he clasped Elliot's shoulder. Keep your powder dry, friend. And remember, truth's like cream. Given time, it always rises. After Thad disappeared, into the timber, Elliot stood looking out at the snow-covered yard. Hallie moved to stand beside him, not touching, but close enough to share warmth. I've got some snowshoes, he said suddenly. Might be good for you to learn, case we need to move quick sometime. Hallie nodded, grateful for this practical response to the morning's revelations. They went out into the yard, where Elliot showed her how to strap the webbed shoes onto her boots. Small steps at first, he instructed, like a duck waddling. Lift your feet clear or you'll catch the edge and… Before he could finish, Hallie's foot tangled, and she pitched forward with a surprised, "Oh!" Elliot caught her arm, steadying her, and a laugh escaped him. A warm, genuine sound she hadn't heard before. Hallie found herself laughing too, the tension of the morning breaking like spring ice. She tried again, exaggerating her duck walk until Elliot's chuckles returned. There you go, he encouraged, as she managed several steps without stumbling. You're a natural. The late afternoon sun painted the snow in shades of rose and gold. They practiced until Hallie could make a full circuit of the yard, her confidence growing with each round. When she finally stumbled again, landing in a soft drift, their shared laughter rang out across the clearing, the sound of something new and fragile taking root between them. The truth of Cimarron Pass hung in the air still, but it felt different now. Not a shadow of fear, but a testament to mercy. Hallie watched Elliot demonstrate a turn in his snowshoes, his movements sure and practiced, and saw him clearly, not as the butcher of whispered rumors, but as a man who'd sacrificed everything to save innocent lives. As the sun settled toward the ridge, they returned to the cabin. The smell of Thad's smoked trout welcomed them back to warmth and shelter. Hallie's legs ached pleasantly from the afternoon's exercise, and her heart felt lighter despite the morning's heavy news. The Army patrol might be searching, but here in this hidden clearing, truth had already found its way home. Like Thad said, it had risen to the surface, clear as cream in morning coffee. The storm rolled in before dawn, rattling the cabin's shutters with wet snow and wind. Hallie woke to find Elliot already stoking the stove, his movements precise despite the dim light. The familiar scent of coffee brewing mingled with wood smoke and the sharp tang of coming breakfast. "Morning," he said softly, careful not to startle her. "Storm's settled in for a spell. Reckon we'll stay close to home today." Hallie nodded, wrapping her shawl tighter as she moved to help. The word home caught in her chest like a warm coal. 2 weeks ago, she'd never imagined having a real home, let alone one with such gentle courtesy in it. "Oats need stirring," Elliot said, reaching for the molasses jug. "Mind the damper on the stove. Pull it halfway out when you're cooking. Push it in to bank the fire." Shikor followed his instructions, watching how the flame responded to each adjustment. The porridge thickened nicely, and soon they sat down to steaming bowls sweetened with dark molasses. Outside, the storm keened through the pines. "Best mend that broken snowshoe today," Elliot said between bites. "Show you how it's done. Might need them sound if this weather holds." After breakfast, he brought the damaged snowshoe to the table, along with strips of rawhide and a small knife. Hallie watched as his scarred hands worked with surprising delicacy, weaving the new webbing through the wooden frame. "Like this," he demonstrated. "Keep the tension even. Too tight and it'll snap in the cold. Too loose and your foot'll sink through." Hallie tried her hand at the weaving, tongue caught between her teeth in concentration. Her first attempts were clumsy, but Elliot's patience never wavered. "That's right," he encouraged. "You've got steady hands." She flushed at the praise. "Mama always said my hands were too big. Said everything about me was too big." The words slipped out before she could catch them. Elliot's fingers stilled on the rawhide. "Your mother was wrong," he said quietly. "Scripture says you're fearfully and wonderfully made. Psalm 139. God don't make mistakes, Hallie." Tears pricked at her eyes. She'd never heard anyone speak against her mother's judgment before. The morning passed in quiet industry. When the snowshoe was mended, Elliot brought in a freshly caught hare from his morning trap check. "Time you learned this too," he said, laying out his skinning knife. "Part of mountain living." He showed her how to hang and skin the animal, his movements quick and clean. "Nothing wasted," he explained. "Hide for patches, meat for the pot, even the bones have use." Hallie's stomach turned at first, but she set her jaw and followed his lead. By the time they'd finished, she felt a strange pride in the neat job they'd made of it. The storm began to clear as afternoon faded toward evening. Hallie stirred the rabbit stew while Elliot split more kindling. The familiar rhythm of domestic tasks filled her with a peace she'd never known in her mother's chaos. After supper, they sat by the fire, as usual, Elliot reading from his worn Bible. The flames painted shadows on the log walls, and somewhere outside, a lone owl called. Without planning to, Hallie began to hum. The tune was one she'd learned in secret, listening outside the church when her mother was deep in her cups. "Come, ye sinners," a song of mercy she'd been forbidden to sing, Her voice wavered at first, uncertain, but grew stronger with each verse. "Come, ye sinners, poor and needy, weak and wounded, sick and sore. Jesus ready stands to save you, full of pity, love, and power." When she finished, the cabin fell silent except for the pop and hiss of burning pine. She looked up to find Elliot watching her, his eyes bright with something she couldn't name. "Would you permit me," he said carefully, "to hold your hand while we pray?" Hallie's heart jumped. She nodded, not trusting her voice. His calloused palm was warm against hers as they bowed their heads. He prayed simply, thanking God for safety, for daily bread, for the gift of song. When they raised their heads, he didn't let go of her hand. "Hallie," he said, his voice low and earnest, "I've got something needs saying, if you'll hear it." She nodded again, pulse quickening. "I've got gold enough put by for 2 to live decent," he began. "Saved it careful these past years, but I won't offer marriage unless my heart's given proper, and yours too. That ain't something to rush." He paused, choosing his words with care. "What I'm asking is, would you consider a proper courtship? We'd wait to speak vows until we can stand before witnesses, do everything right and proper. But I'd like your permission to set my heart toward that end, if God wills it." Hallie's free hand flew to her mouth, tears spilling over. Joy burst in her chest like spring ice breaking. This careful, honorable man wanted to court her, who'd never been wanted by anyone. "Yes," she whispered. "Oh, yes." Relief and happiness transformed Elliot's weathered face. He squeezed her hand once, gently, then released it. They sat quietly then, watching the fire settle. No more words were needed. The soft pop of pitch in the hearth and the distant calling of night birds filled the comfortable silence. When it came time for sleep, Hallie lay in her narrow bed, heart too full for immediate rest. Across the room, she could hear Elliot's steady breathing from his buffalo robe by the fire. Outside, the storm had blown itself out, leaving crystal stars in its wake. Her last thought before drifting off was of the scripture Elliot had quoted, "Fearfully and wonderfully made." For the first time in her life, she began to believe it might be true. The next morning dawned clear and sharp, sunlight striking rainbow sparks from the fresh snow. They fell into their routine, oats and coffee for breakfast, then the day's tasks. But something had shifted, soft and subtle as new snow. Their movements around each other had a new awareness, their shared glances carrying quiet joy. Elliot taught her more about the stove's moods that day, how to bank the fire just so for bread baking, how to read the heat by the color of the iron. "Living up here, you need to know your tools," he explained, showing her how to judge the dampness of kindling by its weight. "Could save your life someday." They worked together skinning another rabbit, Hallie's hand steadier now with practice. When she managed a particularly neat cut, Elliot's approving nod warmed her more than the stove ever could. That evening, after another simple but filling supper, Hallie found herself humming again. This time she sang Amazing Grace, her voice stronger than before. Elliot joined in on the chorus, his deep bass complementing her sweet alto. The last notes faded. He reached for her hand again for evening prayers. His touch was still careful, still respectful, but now it held promise, like a seed waiting for spring. Their prayer that night was one of gratitude, for safety in storms, for daily provision, for the unexpected gift of finding family in this hidden mountain place. When they settled for sleep, the hearth's gentle popping painted the cabin in peace. Tomorrow would bring its own tasks and challenges, but for now, this was enough. This quiet joy, this careful beginning, this hope taking root between them like spring grass under melting snow. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's small window. Frost had traced delicate patterns on the glass overnight, catching the growing light like spun sugar. Elliot was already up, moving quietly as he gathered their traveling necessities. Hallie stirred beneath her woolen blanket, watching as he checked his saddlebags with methodical care. His movements were precise, each item considered and placed with purpose. "We need to ride to town today," he said softly when he noticed her watching. "Running low on flour and lamp oil, and—" He paused, a gentle smile touching his weathered face. "Thought we might speak with the preacher about a quiet wedding." Hallie's heart quickened at the words. A proper wedding, with God's blessing and witnesses. The thought warmed her more than the banked coals in the hearth. They shared a simple breakfast of the last cornbread and coffee, then began preparing for the journey. Elliot showed her how to cache their valuables, his small store of gold dust, her mother's payment hidden beneath a loose floorboard. He demonstrated how to properly douse the hearth, explaining how a single spark could spell disaster while they were away. "Banking coals is fine when you're here to watch them," he said, carefully spreading ashes over the dying embers. "But for travel, best to start fresh when we return." Outside, the morning air bit sharp and clean. Their breath rose in white puffs as Elliot saddled the bay horse and the sturdy pack mule. The snow that had fallen over the past days lay thick and unbroken, except for the trails of small animals seeking breakfast. Elliot helped Hallie mount, making sure her skirts were properly arranged on the side saddle. The leather creaked as she settled herself, still not entirely comfortable, but growing more confident with each day's practice. They set out along the timber trail, moving at an easy pace. The snow squeaked beneath the animals' hooves, a rhythmic sound that matched their steady progress. Elliot led them through stands of pine and aspen, following paths that seemed invisible to Hallie's untrained eye. "Taking it slow," he explained, glancing back to check on her. "No need to tire the animals, and the footing's uncertain under this snow." Around noon, they reached a creek, its surface frozen into abstract patterns. Elliot dismounted first, helping Hallie down before attending to the animals. He took out a small hatchet and carefully broke through the ice, creating holes where the horse and mule could drink. While the animals watered, they shared dried meat and the last of their apples. Elliot pulled a folded paper from his shirt pocket, a psalm he'd copied in careful letters for Hallie to practice her reading. "The Lord is my shepherd," Hallie began slowly, finger tracing beneath each word. "I shall not want." When she stumbled over righteousness, Elliot helped her sound it out, his voice patient and encouraging. The familiar words took on new meaning here in the wilderness, with snow-laden branches above and the sound of water moving beneath ice below. After their rest, they mounted up again. The afternoon sun had grown strong enough to make the snow glitter, and high above, a red-tailed hawk wheeled in lazy circles. "Good sign," Elliot said, nodding towards the bird. "Hawks don't soar like that when storm's coming. We'll have fair weather for the ride back." The shadows were lengthening when the first buildings of town came into view. Hallie felt her shoulders tense at the sight of the familiar structures. The livery stable with its weathered walls, the blacksmith's shop where the forge fire glowed orange through the open door. Smoke rose straight and thin from the chimney of the one-room church, a simple white-painted building that seemed to glow in the late afternoon light. Elliot guided them to the church's hitching rail, securing both animals with practiced hands. He helped Hallie down, then stood for a moment, scanning the quiet street before leading her toward the church door. The sanctuary was empty but warm, lit by oil lamps that cast a gentle glow over the rough-hewn pews. Their footsteps echoed on the wooden floor as they moved down the center aisle. The air smelled of lamp oil and pine, with lingering traces of Sunday's incense. Elliot paused at the poor box near the door, deliberately placing several coins inside. The metal made a soft clicking sound as it fell. Then he took out a pencil stub and paper, writing a careful note to Preacher Lyle, requesting a meeting the next day. "Best to do things proper," he said quietly, his voice respectful in the sacred space. "Get his blessing and arrange for witnesses." As they stepped back outside, evening was settling over the town. Lamps were being lit in windows, and the smell of supper's cooking drifted on the cooling air. Elliot led them away from the saloon district, where raucous voices were already beginning to spill into the street. The Mercantile's upper floor offered clean, if simple, rooms for travelers. The proprietor's wife, a thin woman with kind eyes, showed them to separate chambers connected by a small sitting room. "Stoves laid with wood," she explained, lighting the lamps. "Washstands got fresh water, and there's extra quilts in the chest if you need them." When she'd gone, Elliot checked both rooms carefully, then moved his saddlebags into the smaller one. "I'll take first watch," he said, his hand briefly touching his holstered Colt. "Old habits die hard up here." Hallie nodded, understanding his caution. Even in town, especially in town, they couldn't afford to be careless. She retired to her room, listening to Elliot's quiet movements as he settled into the chair by the sitting room window. Through the thin walls, she could hear the town's nighttime sounds: horses nickering in the livery, bootsteps on wooden sidewalks, distant piano music from the saloon. But here, with Elliot's steady presence just beyond her door, she felt safer than she ever had in her mother's house. She knelt beside her bed, offering up a prayer of thanks for protection on their journey, for Elliot's patient kindness, and for the hope of a proper marriage blessed by God and witnessed by good people. Tomorrow they would speak with Preacher Lyle, taking another step toward the life they were building together. The lamp's gentle light filled the small room as Hallie prepared for sleep. She could hear Elliot shifting in his chair, keeping his quiet vigil. Outside, the town settled into its nighttime routine, but here in their rented rooms, peace prevailed. A peace built on trust, respect, and the promise of tomorrow's meeting with the preacher. Morning painted the church windows with golden light, each pane rimmed in delicate frost patterns. Inside the vestry, Preacher Josiah Lyle's thin frame cast a long shadow across the worn floorboards as he listened to Elliot and Hallie's story. His kind eyes moved between them, taking in every detail, from Hallie's nervous fingers twisting in her skirts to Elliot's steady, honest gaze. "Marriage is sacred before God," Preacher Lyle said finally, adjusting his wire-rimmed spectacles, "and I see his hand in bringing you two together. But—" He paused, reaching for a leather-bound ledger on his desk. "There's the matter of an old accusation that still sits heavy in our town records." Elliot nodded gravely. "The Cimarron Pass incident." "Yes." The preacher's fingers traced down a page of careful script. "Some call you Butcher, though I've never credited such talk myself. Still, for the sake of proper order and your future peace, this cloud needs clearing." "I can bring a witness," Elliot said quietly. "Someone who knows the truth of what happened that day." Preacher Lyle closed the ledger with careful hands. "Then I'll marry you 2 days hence, after Sunday worship. Give you time to set things right." He smiled gently at Hallie. "And perhaps find a proper dress for the occasion?" Hallie blushed, smoothing her worn skirt. "Yes, sir, thank you." They left the church's warmth for the crisp morning air. The Mercantile's bell chimed as they entered, and Hallie breathed in the familiar smells of coffee beans, leather, and dried goods. Elliot pressed coins into her palm. "Choose what you need," he said softly. Something warm for winter. Hallie moved carefully through the store's narrow aisles. Her fingers brushed past bright calicos and delicate muslins, settling instead on a practical gray wool shawl. The merchant's wife helped her wrap it around her shoulders, nodding approval at the sturdy weave. "Good choice for mountain weather," she said, while Elliot paid for the shawl and several pounds of flour. They stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, the flour sack secure in Elliot's arms, when a harsh voice cut through the morning quiet. "Well, if it ain't my ungrateful daughter and her murderin' man." Hallie's heart clenched. Her mother, Abigail Brinker, stood swaying in the saloon doorway, her face twisted with spite. The smell of whiskey carried even across the street. "Look at you," Mrs. Brinker sneered, lurching forward. "Puttin' on airs with that fancy shawl. Think you're better in your raising?" Her bloodshot eyes fixed on Elliot. "And you, butcher, taking what's mine without proper payment." "Ma'am," Elliot said evenly, "I paid fair price for Hallie's care." "Care!" Mrs. Brinker spat into the dirt. "She's my property. I want her back, or I want bounty money for harboring a killer." People were stopping to stare now. Hallie felt herself shrinking under their curious gazes, but Elliot's hand found her elbow, steadying her. "Come along," he murmured. "No good comes from public quarrels." They moved away from Mrs. Brinker's continued jeers, Elliot keeping himself between Hallie and her mother's hate-filled words. The flour sack swung steady in his grip, his other hand never leaving Hallie's arm. As afternoon faded toward evening, they made their way to the livery stable. The owner, an old man who'd known Elliot before Cimarron Pass, showed them to the hayloft without questions. "Safer than the mercantile tonight," he said gruffly. "I'll keep watch below." The loft was clean, sweet with fresh hay. Elliot spread their bedrolls far apart, respecting propriety even here. Through the small window, they could see the telegraph office's lights still burning. "Wait here," Elliot said softly. "I need to send a message." He returned shortly with a carefully folded paper. "Telegram to Agent McKinnon at the Ute Agency," he explained, showing Hallie the neat writing. "Asking him to help locate any of the young ones who survived that day at Cimarron Pass. Their testimony would clear things proper." "Will he help?" Hallie asked, watching lamplight play across Elliot's scarred hands. "McKinnon's a fair man, knows the truth of what happened." Elliot tucked the paper away. "Paid extra for quick dispatch. Operator promised a reply by tomorrow night." They settled into their separate corners as darkness deepened. Below, they could hear the livery owner moving about, checking doors and latches. Somewhere in town, a dog barked, and the saloon piano played a tinny tune. Hallie pulled her new shawl closer, the wool soft against her cheek. Despite her mother's cruel words, despite the uncertainty still ahead, she felt hope growing stronger. Elliot was a good man, seeking truth rather than vengeance. Tomorrow's telegram might bring the witness they needed to clear his name. Through the loft window, stars winked between passing clouds. Hallie watched them until her eyes grew heavy, lulled by the peaceful sounds of horses shifting in their stalls below. The last thing she saw before sleep was Elliot's silhouette against the window, keeping quiet vigil as he waited for word from the agency. Word that might finally lay the ghosts of Cimarron Pass to rest. Dawn brought a quiet Sunday to the mining town, frost glittering on weathered storefronts and the church's simple cross. Elliot and Hallie moved cautiously through the streets, keeping to shadows when possible, staying within sight of each other always. The morning air held the sharp bite of coming winter, making Hallie grateful for her new gray wool shawl. Around mid-morning, Preacher Lyle found them near the mercantile, his wire-rimmed spectacles fogged from the cold. "If you've a mind to," he said softly. "There's room in the back pew for worship. No one will trouble you in God's house." Hallie's heart lifted at the invitation. It had been years since she'd sat proper in a church service, her mother having forbidden it after claiming the congregation looked down on them. Elliot noticed her expression and nodded. "Much obliged, preacher. We'll come quiet-like before the bell." They slipped into the church just as early worshippers began arriving. The back pew felt safe, tucked in shadow beneath the low balcony. Hallie watched families file in, minors in clean shirts, wives in faded but pressed dresses, children with slicked-down hair. No one stared openly, though a few cast curious glances their way. Preacher Lyle's sermon spoke of mercy and judgment, how God alone knew the truth in men's hearts. His kind eyes swept the congregation, lingering briefly on their corner. "Let he who is without sin cast the first stone," he quoted, and Hallie felt Elliot's shoulder tense beside her. After the final hymn, several churchwomen gathered in the side room to prepare the weekly poor offering, simple fare of beans and bread for those in need. One gray-haired woman noticed Hallie hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "Could use another pair of hands," she said matter-of-factly, gesturing to a stack of bowls. "If you're willing?" Hallie stepped forward eagerly. The familiar work of serving others settled her nerves. She ladled beans carefully, broke bread into equal portions, and helped arrange everything on the long table. The women worked alongside her with small smiles and quiet thanks, asking no questions about who she was or why she'd come. Their acceptance, however temporary, wrapped around her like a warm blanket. Through the window, she could see Elliot speaking with Preacher Lyle in the churchyard, their breath frosting in the cold air. He kept his back to the wall, eyes scanning the street even as they talked. The sight made her heart ache, a good man forced to watch shadows. The afternoon passed slowly. They stayed close to the church, not wanting to risk the open streets more than necessary. As dusk approached, Elliot made his way to the telegraph office, Hallie waiting in the shelter of a nearby alley. The operator, a thin man with ink-stained fingers, handed over a yellow paper. "Just came through," he said, as Elliot unfolded the message. "Took some relaying to reach the agency." Hallie watched Elliot's face as he read, saw the tight lines around his mouth ease slightly. "Good news?" she whispered when he rejoined her. "There's a Ute scout named Kavi," he said quietly. "Says he can ride in within 2 days, weather permitting. He's bringing a statement about what really happened at Cimarron Pass." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a nickel, walking back to press it into the operator's hand. "Much obliged for the quick service." The operator nodded, tucking the coin away. "Hope whatever's in that message helps set things straight," he said. "Town's got enough troubles without old ghosts stirring up new ones." As night settled over the town, lamplight spilled from the saloon windows, along with the sound of rough laughter and a badly tuned piano. Elliot and Hallie were sharing a simple supper of dried beef and hard crackers in the church vestry when they heard voices growing louder outside. Through the window, they could see Mrs. Brinker's figure weaving down the boardwalk, clearly deep in her cups. She stopped 2 men in uniform, off-duty soldiers by their loosened collars, and began gesturing animatedly toward the church. Even from inside, they could hear snippets of her shrill voice, "Murderer," and "My girl," and "Reward money." Hallie's hands began to shake. "Elliot, we should go. Take to the trees while we can." But Elliot shook his head, his face set with quiet determination. "Running now would only prove their lies, make me look guilty of everything they've claimed." He placed his Colt carefully on the vestry table, then deliberately removed the bullets, setting them aside. "We'll stay here, if the preacher allows. Show we've nothing to hide." As if summoned by the thought, Preacher Lyle appeared in the doorway. He took in the scene: the unloaded gun, Hallie's frightened face, the sound of Mrs. Brinker's voice still carrying from the street. Without a word, he moved to latch the heavy door. "You're welcome to sleep here tonight," he said simply. "The vestry's warm enough with the stove, and God's house should be sanctuary for those seeking justice." He crossed to a shelf and took down his Bible, opening it to a marked page. "I've been reviewing the wedding service. Traditional vows, if that suits you both." Hallie blinked back tears as she saw the familiar words written there. "To have and to hold from this day forward." The candlelight made the pages glow golden, like a promise of dawn after long darkness. They arranged simple bedding, Hallie on the narrow vestry cot, Elliot on his bedroll near the stove, the preacher in his study through the connecting door. The unloaded Colt remained on the table between them, a symbol of trust more powerful than any weapon. Through the walls, they could hear Mrs. Brinker's voice growing fainter as she led the soldiers away, likely toward the saloon to further poison their minds with whiskey and lies. But here in the vestry, peace settled like a blanket. The candle's flame drew dancing shadows on the open Bible, highlighting words of faith and love that had survived far worse storms than this. Hallie watched the flame until her eyes grew heavy. Her last waking thought was of Kavi, this unknown Ute scout riding through the mountains with truth in his saddlebags. 2 days, Elliot had said. 2 days until proof could clear his name. She prayed the weather would hold, and that those who sought vengeance would be patient that long. The candle burned low, its light touching the wedding vows Preacher Lyle had marked. Outside, the town slowly quieted except for the occasional burst of saloon noise. Elliot sat awake in the darkness, alert but calm, his faith as steady as the stars wheeling overhead. Tomorrow would bring what it brought. For tonight, they were safe in God's house, waiting for justice to find its way home. Sunday morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind that made window frost glitter like diamonds. Church bells echoed across the snow-dusted town, calling the faithful to worship. One by one, families emerged from their homes, miners in patched but clean coats, wives with carefully mended shawls, children with hair slicked down and faces scrubbed pink. Inside the church, Hallie sat beside Elliot in their back pew, watching the congregation file in. Her gray wool shawl wrapped tight against the morning chill, she noticed how different this felt from services she'd glimpsed through windows in years past. The worn hymnal in her hands, the pressed wood beneath her, the soft murmur of greeting. It all felt real, solid, like belonging. Mrs. Cooper, the blacksmith's wife, nodded kindly as she passed. Her youngest daughter waved shyly at Hallie, remembering yesterday's help with the poor offering. Even old Mr. Jenkins, who never smiled at anyone, touched his hat brim when Elliot held the door for him. The morning light streamed through frost-rimmed windows, casting rainbow shadows across the wooden floor. Preacher Lyle stood at his pulpit, Bible open before him, as the last stragglers found their seats. His voice, when it came, filled the small sanctuary with warmth. "Brothers and sisters," he began, "today we speak of mercy." His kind eyes swept the congregation, settling briefly on Hallie and Elliot's corner. Of how God's grace finds us in our darkest moments when we least expect it and least believe we deserve it. Hallie felt tears prick her eyes as the sermon continued. Every word seemed meant for her, for the ache of unworthiness her mother had planted deep in her heart. Beside her, Elliot sat still as stone, but she could feel the tension in his shoulder where it pressed against hers. "Judge not," Preacher Lyle continued, "lest ye be judged. For with what judgment ye judge, ye shall be judged." He paused, letting the words settle. How quick we are to condemn what we do not understand. How slow to extend the very mercy we ourselves have received. The congregation shifted in their seats, some nodding, others looking down at their hands. Hallie saw Mrs. Cooper dab at her eyes with a handkerchief. But God's mercy, Lyle's voice strengthened, is larger than our fear, His love deeper than our doubt, and His truth, here he looked directly at Elliot, will always find its way to light. As the final hymn faded and the benediction was given, Preacher Lyle raised his hand to keep the congregation seated. "Before we disperse," he said, "I have a matter of importance to address." He gestured for Hallie and Elliot to come forward. These two souls seek to join their lives before God and this community. If there be no objection, I propose to conduct their wedding this very afternoon. Hallie's heart thundered as they walked down the center aisle. She felt every eye upon them, heard the soft rustle of whispers. But for once, she didn't shrink from the attention. Elliot's steady presence beside her gave her strength. They had almost reached the altar when the heavy church doors burst open with a bang that made several women gasp. Hallie's mother, Mrs. Brinker, stood in the doorway, her face flushed with drink despite the early hour. Behind her loomed Sergeant Hale in full uniform, flanked by two young privates with rifles. "There's your murderer!" Mrs. Brinker shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at Elliot. "Stealing my property and hiding from justice!" Sergeant Hale strode down the aisle, boots echoing on the wooden floor. "Elliot Crane," he announced in a clipped voice, "you are wanted on suspicion of murder and obstruction of justice in the matter of Cimarron Pass." Before anyone could move, Hallie stepped between them and Elliot. Her whole body trembled, but her voice came out clear and strong. "He's innocent," she declared, "and I'm not property to be stolen. I chose to leave." The congregation watched in stunned silence as Hale's hand moved to his pistol. "Step aside, miss. This is Army business." "This is God's house," Preacher Lyle interrupted firmly, "and we will handle this with dignity and due process." Elliot gently touched Hallie's shoulder, moving her aside. "No need for force," he said quietly, holding his hands open and empty. "I'll come peaceful-like." His eyes met Hale's. "But I ask to be held here in town, not dragged to the fort. Let the truth come to us, rather than bury it in Army paperwork." Hale's jaw tightened, but Preacher Lyle stepped forward. "As a minister of this community, I second that request. Let him be held in our jail until this matter is properly investigated." The sergeant hesitated, clearly weighing his options. The two privates shifted uncomfortably, looking very young beneath their military bearing. Finally, Hale nodded curtly. "The town jail will do, for now, until higher orders come through." Mrs. Brinker wasn't finished. She grabbed Hallie's arm with bony fingers. "And my daughter comes home where she belongs. No more living in sin with a killer." "Mother, please," Hallie started, but the older woman's grip tightened painfully. "Quiet. You'll do as you're told for once in your worthless life." The congregation began to disperse, most hurrying past with averted eyes, though a few cast sympathetic glances at Hallie. Mrs. Cooper paused as if to speak, but her husband hurried her along. Preacher Lyle watched helplessly as the soldiers led Elliot away, while Mrs. Brinker dragged Hallie in the opposite direction. The law gave him no power to intervene in family matters, no matter how wrong they might be. The town jail was a small stone building with 2 cells, usually empty except for the occasional drunk needing to sleep it off. Elliot walked inside without resistance, his back straight and dignified. The iron door clanged shut with a finality that echoed through the quiet street. Across town, Mrs. Brinker shoved Hallie into the cramped boarding room above the saloon. "Think you're too good for your own mother, do you?" she sneered, pawing through Hallie's pockets. "Running off with the first man who'd take you? Where's the money he gave you?" There isn't any, Hallie said truthfully. He's an honest man. The slap came fast and hard. Honest? He's a murderer who'll swing when the army's done with him. Mrs. Brinker's alcohol-soured breath filled the small space. And you'll stay right here where I can keep an eye on you. She stormed out, the key turning in the lock with a harsh click. Hallie sank onto the narrow bed, her cheek stinging, and stared at the stained ceiling. The sounds of the saloon drifted up through the floorboards, coarse laughter, the clank of glasses, a badly played piano. As evening settled over the town, Hallie pressed her face against the cold window glass. Somewhere across the streets, Elliot sat in his cell, probably reading his pocket Bible by the last light of day. She closed her eyes and whispered the psalm he'd taught her that first day on the trail. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. Tears slid down her cheeks, but her voice grew stronger with each verse. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. The words felt like a lifeline between them, a thread of hope in the gathering dark. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Below, the saloon's noise grew louder as night drew in, but Hallie kept whispering, letting the familiar words wash over her like a blessing. She might be locked away, but her heart remained free and full of a faith stronger than iron bars or wooden doors. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. The last word came out as barely a breath, but she knew God heard it. Somewhere in the darkness, she thought she caught the distant sound of horse hooves. Perhaps Kavi already riding through the night, bringing truth closer with every step. She wrapped her shawl tighter and began the psalm again, each repetition a quiet act of defiance against despair. Morning brought a sullen gray light to the boarding room window. Hallie had barely slept, her mind churning with worry for Elliot. The floorboards creaked as her mother paced below, already drinking despite the early hour. Straightening her wrinkled dress, Hallie took a deep breath and knocked on the inside of her door. Mother, we need food for the week. Let me go to the mercantile. Footsteps thumped up the stairs. The key rattled, and Mrs. Brinker's face appeared, eyes narrowed with suspicion. And why should I trust you not to run off? Hallie met her gaze steadily. Because I have $2 saved, enough for a week's boarding rent if you let me fetch supplies. She pulled the coins from her pocket, letting them catch the light. We could share the cost, both eat better. Her mother's expression wavered between greed and distrust. Finally, hunger and the promise of coin won out. Fine, but I'm coming with you. No tricks. They descended to the street, where morning frost still glazed the boardwalk. Hallie walked carefully, aware of her mother's sharp eyes on her back. At the mercantile, she filled a basket with practical items: flour, salt pork, coffee beans. Her hands moved deliberately as she counted out portions, mind racing ahead to her real purpose. We should get bread too, Hallie suggested, keeping her voice neutral. Fresh-baked costs less than flour per loaf this time of year. Mrs. Brinker grunted agreement, already eyeing the whiskey behind the counter. While she haggled with the shopkeeper over a bottle's price, Hallie slipped to the bakery next door. The warm, yeasty smell wrapped around her like a blessing. 2 loaves, she told the baker's wife, then added in a lower voice. And could you wrap one in a clean cloth, for someone who needs it? The woman's kind eyes showed understanding. She wrapped the second loaf carefully, adding a pat of butter wrapped in paper. No extra charge, dear. Hallie tucked the bundle under her shawl just as her mother appeared in the doorway. They walked back into the bitter wind, Mrs. Brinker clutching her wrapped bottle. At the jail, Hallie paused. "The coffee pot's nearly empty," she said. "Let me fetch water from the pump here. Save walking to the creek." Her mother waved impatiently, more interested in getting back to her whiskey. "Be quick about it." Hallie filled the pot slowly, timing her movements. When Mrs. Brinker turned to cough, she slipped around the corner of the jail. The side window was barred but unglassed. Through it, she could see Elliot sitting on his cot, Bible open on his knee. "Elliot," she whispered. He looked up, moving quickly to the window. A bruise darkened his jaw. Someone's fist had found him in the night. Still, his eyes were clear and steady. "You shouldn't risk this," he murmured, but his hand reached through the bars to touch hers. "Here." She passed him the wrapped bread and butter. "And coffee, once it's boiled." She poured some water into his tin cup through the bars. "Listen quick. What should I do?" "Find Preacher Lyle," Elliot said softly. "And the telegraph man. We need that scout's testimony before Hale decides to move me to the fort." He squeezed her fingers. "Be careful, though. Don't— Girl, where are you?" Mrs. Brinker's voice cut through the morning air. Hallie pressed Elliot's hand once more and hurried back around the corner, hefting the coffee pot. "Coming, Mother?" The pump was stiff with ice. They returned to the boarding house, where Mrs. Brinker immediately uncorked her bottle. Hallie busied herself with the stove, brewing coffee and heating beans. The familiar tasks steadied her hands while her mind worked. Once her mother was settled with her cup liberally dosed with whiskey, Hallie began sweeping. She worked her way towards the door, humming a hymn. "The floor needs a good scrubbing," she said. "I should fetch more water." Mrs. Brinker was already glassy-eyed. "Don't take all day about it." Hallie grabbed the bucket and hurried out. Instead of heading to the pump, she made straight for the church. Preacher Lyle was in his study, writing his next sermon. He looked up as she entered, face creasing with concern. "Child, are you well? I've been praying about yesterday's trouble." "I need your help," Hallie said quickly. "Will you write a statement? About Elliot attending church, not hiding or running? Something official?" Lyle nodded, already reaching for fresh paper. "A sound idea. I'll attest to his character and peaceful conduct." His pen scratched across the page as he wrote in careful script, adding his signature and the church seal. "Thank you," Hallie breathed. "Now I must find the telegraph operator before Mother notices I'm gone." The telegraph office was warm, clicks and whirs filling the air. The operator, Mr. Peters, looked up from his keys. His fingers never stopped moving as he spoke. "Another message to the agency?" he asked, reading her expression. "Please, we need to know exactly when Kavi will arrive. There's talk of moving Elliot to the fort." Peters nodded, tapping out the inquiry. They waited in tense silence until the reply came clicking back. He translated the dots and dashes. "Scout Kavi departed yesterday. Should arrive by tomorrow noon if weather holds." Hallie's heart lifted. One day. They just needed to hold things together for one more day. But when she stepped outside, fat snowflakes were already falling. The promised squall was blowing in from the mountains, thick clouds darkening the noon sky. Wind whipped her skirts as she hurried back to the boarding house, bucket now filled with water to maintain her excuse. Mrs. Brinker was dozing in her chair, empty bottle on the floor. Hallie quietly began scrubbing the floorboards, making visible work of it. Every few minutes she glanced out the window, watching the snow fall heavier. Would it delay Kavi? Would Sergeant Hale use the weather as excuse to move Elliot? She needed more help. When her mother's snores grew steady, Hallie tore a page from an old newspaper and wrote a quick note. "Please meet me at dusk behind the church. Must speak about tomorrow's hearing." She signed it with a simple H. Keeping to her chores, she gradually worked her way downstairs. The saloon was quiet this early, just a few regulars nursing their drinks. None paid attention to a girl sweeping the back step. From there, it was easy to slip around to the church and tuck the note under the rear door where Lyle would find it during his evening prayers. The afternoon crept by. The snow showed no sign of letting up, blanketing the town in muffling white. As dusk approached, Hallie laid out a cold supper for her mother, who had moved from whiskey sleep to whiskey wake and back again. Then she took up the empty water bucket one more time. "Going to the pump before full dark," she called. This time, her mother only grunted. The church loomed dark against the gray sky. Lyle waited at the back door, holding a hooded lantern. His presence was both protection and propriety. A young woman couldn't walk alone after dark, but with a preacher as escort, none could object. "I received your note," he said quietly. "You want to see the sheriff?" Hallie nodded, snow catching in her shawl. "We need a proper hearing scheduled, before Sergeant Hale tries anything." "Agreed." Lyle lifted the lantern. "Come. Having a minister speak for law and order may carry some weight." They walked through the thickening snow to the sheriff's office. Light glowed behind its frosted windows. Inside, they found both the sheriff and Sergeant Hale, arguing over jurisdiction papers. The sheriff looked up first. "Evening, preacher. Miss Brinker. What brings you out in this weather?" "Justice and proper procedure," Lyle said firmly. "This young woman requests a formal hearing for Elliot Crane, tomorrow morning before any discussion of transfer to military custody." Hale's face darkened. "The Army has authority here. He's wanted for military crimes." "Then surely you don't object to establishing those crimes in open court?" Lyle's voice was mild, but carried steel beneath. "With witnesses present, including the Ute scout who's riding in?" The sergeant's jaw worked. "The weather may delay things. Military transport should take priority." "The weather," the sheriff interrupted, "is exactly why we should wait. No sense risking lives on mountain trails until we know what's what." He gave Hale a level look. "A hearing's proper procedure, Sergeant. Tomorrow at 10 o'clock. Hale glared, but finally gave a sharp nod. 10 o'clock then. But I want guards posted tonight. No chances of escape in this storm." "Agreed," the sheriff said. "I'll see to it myself." He turned to Hallie and Lyle. "Will that suit, miss?" "Yes, sir. Thank you." Hallie's voice was steady despite her pounding heart. One more night. One more day. Time enough for truth to arrive. "I'll see you safely back," Lyle said, raising his lantern against the darkness. They stepped out into the swirling snow, which had already covered their earlier tracks. The walk back was silent, each lost in prayer and worry. At the boarding house door, Lyle pressed Hallie's hand. "Keep faith, child. God's timing is not always our timing, but His purposes will stand." Hallie climbed the stairs quietly, slipping into her room. Her mother's snores still rattled from next door. Outside her window, snow continued to fall, thick and white in the lamplight. Somewhere out on the mountain trails, a young Ute scout was riding through the storm, carrying truth like a torch against the night. She knelt by her bed, lips moving in the psalm Elliot had taught her. Not just words anymore, but a lifeline of hope in the gathering dark. Tomorrow would bring either deliverance or deeper trouble. But tonight, she could still praise, still trust, still believe in mercy's triumph over fear. Dawn broke over a transformed world. The storm had left the town buried under 3 feet of pristine snow, its buildings like sugar-dusted cakes in the early light. Icicles hung from every eave, catching the sun's first rays and scattering tiny rainbows across the drifts. Inside the boarding house, Hallie woke early. She dressed carefully in her cleanest dress, a faded blue cotton that had seen better days but was still respectable. Her fingers trembled as she pinned her hair, thinking of the hearing ahead. Through the frosted window, she could see men already breaking trails between buildings with shovels and determined boots. The church bell rang 8 o'clock, its clear tone carrying far in the crystalline air. Hallie made her way downstairs, avoiding her mother's room where bottles clinked and curses muttered. The street had been partially cleared, though drifts still rose shoulder-high along the boardwalks. She picked her way carefully toward the church, her boots crunching in the fresh snow. The church hall had been transformed overnight. Wooden chairs formed rows facing the pulpit, where a table now served as a makeshift judge's bench. Sheriff Davies had positioned himself behind it, with Preacher Lyle to one side. Already, curious townspeople filed in, stamping snow from their boots and talking in low voices. Sergeant Hale arrived with 2 privates, their uniforms precise despite the weather. They took seats near the front, brass buttons gleaming in the lamplight. The sergeant's face was set in hard lines, his portfolio of papers clutched tight. At 9 o'clock sharp, the sheriff had Elliot brought in. He walked steady between his guards, chains clinking softly. His face was pale but composed, and his eyes found Hallie's immediately. The silent message in them gave her strength. Truth would have its day. "This hearing will come to order," Sheriff Davies announced, his voice filling the hall. "We're here to examine charges against Elliot Crane, specifically regarding events at Cimarron Pass 2 years ago." He nodded to Sergeant Hale. "The Army may present its case." Hale stood, papers rustling. 2 years ago, Crane was a scout with the 7th Cavalry. During winter operations near Cimarron, he shot and killed Sergeant James Morton, then deserted his post. His voice carried cold certainty. The Army considers him both murderer and deserter. "The shooting occurred during what operation?" the sheriff asked. Hale's jaw tightened. "A standard patrol. Details are classified." Preacher Lyle stood then, his thin frame straight as a pine. "If it please the court, I'd like to speak to Elliot Crane's character as we've known it these past years." The sheriff nodded. "Proceed." "Elliot Crane has lived peacefully in our territory, trading fairly, attending worship when weather permits. He's shown himself a man of conscience and restraint." Lyle produced his written statement. "This documents his regular church attendance and good conduct. More importantly, it speaks to his willingness to face these charges openly rather than flee." The door creaked, and heads turned as Mrs. Brinker swept in, her face flushed with either cold or whiskey. She made her way to the front, boots leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. "That man," she declared without waiting to be called, "bought my daughter like a piece of stock, threw some gold dust at me and rode off with her." Her voice dripped venom. "What kind of good character is that?" "Mrs. Brinker," the sheriff cut in. "You'll wait to be called before speaking." But the damage was done. Whispers rippled through the crowd. "I request permission to address this accusation," Hallie said, standing. Her voice shook slightly but grew stronger as she continued. "I was sold against my will, that's true, but not by my choice or Elliot's. He offered me shelter, respect, and honest marriage before God and witnesses." She met her mother's glare steadily. "He saved me from hunger and abuse, treating me with nothing but kindness." Mrs. Brinker started to reply, but a new sound cut through the tension. Hoofbeats approaching outside, then boots on the church steps. The door opened again, admitting a blast of cold air and 2 snow-covered figures. The first was a young Ute man, straight-backed and dignified despite his travel-stained clothes. His dark eyes surveyed the room calmly before settling on Elliot. Behind him came an older white man, carrying a leather document case, his beard rimed with ice. "Agent McKinnon," the man introduced himself. "From the Indian Agency. This is Kavi, one of our official scouts. We've ridden through the night to reach this hearing." The sheriff gestured them forward. "You've come regarding the Cimarron Pass incident?" "Yes." McKinnon opened his case, extracting several papers. "And to correct a long-standing injustice." Kavi stepped forward, his English clear and measured. "I was there that winter day. I was one of the children Elliot Crane saved." His quiet words seemed to fill the whole hall. "We were starving. The winter had been hard. Some of us snuck to the edge of the fort to gather spilled grain from their stores." He paused, meeting Sergeant Hale's eyes. "Sergeant Morton saw us. He raised his rifle, drunk and angry. He would have shot children whose only crime was hunger." Another pause. Elliot Crane stopped him. One shot, clean and necessary. He chose mercy over orders that day. McKinnon laid his papers on the sheriff's table. "These are my original notes from the incident investigation, and a copy of the telegram I sent to Denver headquarters reporting Morton's conduct. Documents that were apparently misplaced at Fort Records." His tone made clear the misplacement had been deliberate. The hall fell silent except for the soft popping of the wood stove. Snow sifted against the windows while the sheriff examined the papers, his face thoughtful. Sergeant Hale's expression had turned to stone. Finally, Hale spoke. "I request 24 hours to verify these documents with Fort Command." The sheriff looked to Lyle, who nodded slowly. "Granted. But Elliot Crane remains under town custody, not military. We'll reconvene tomorrow at this time." As the crowd began to disperse, Kavi approached Elliot. The two men regarded each other silently before Kavi extended his hand. Elliot took it, chains rattling softly. "Thank you, brother," Elliot said quietly. "I keep my debts," Kavi replied, "as you kept faith with my people." The guards led Elliot back towards the jail. Hallie followed at a distance, watching until they had him settled in his cell. The window was small but faced west, catching the afternoon sun. She knelt beside it in the snow, not caring who saw. "I'll bring you supper," she promised through the bars, "and we'll pray together." Elliot's voice came back, soft but steady. "God's timing is perfect, Hallie. Perfect as new snow." Inside the cell, Elliot settled onto his narrow bunk. The last rays of sun painted the walls gold through the window. Outside, he could hear Hallie's voice lifted in prayer, carrying him through the gathering dusk on wings of hope. The town slowly quieted as evening drew in. Lamplights winked on one by one. Smoke rose straight from chimneys into the crystal-clear sky, and the snow began to sparkle with the first stars. Tomorrow would bring its own answers, but tonight, truth had finally broken trail through winter's deepest drifts. The next day dawned bright and bitter cold. Frost patterns decorated the church windows like delicate lace as townspeople went about their morning duties, casting curious glances toward the jail and telegraph office. Inside the warm telegraph room, Sergeant Hale sat ramrod straight at the operator's desk, methodically composing coded messages to Fort Command. The telegraph key clicked steadily, sending his inquiries racing along the wire. Click, click, click. Questions about warrant records. Click, click. Requests for confirmation of the captain's actions. Click, click, click. Demands for clarification about Elliot Crane's service record. Through the morning and into afternoon, replies trickled back. The operator's pencil scratched across paper, translating dots and dashes into words that gradually revealed the truth. With each message, Hale's expression grew more troubled, his military bearing slightly less certain. By late afternoon, the final confirmations arrived. The dead sergeant's captain had indeed faced official reprimand, though it had been quietly handled. More telling still, Elliot Crane's name had never been properly entered into any warrant ledger, a fact that spoke volumes about the original investigation's legitimacy. Hale stood, gathering the telegraph transcripts with precise movements. His boots crunched in the snow as he walked to the church hall, where people were already gathering. Inside, lamplight gleamed off his brass buttons as he made his way to the front. The room hushed as Hale spoke. "I have received full verification from Fort Command." He paused, jaw working. "There was no proper warrant. The original incident was mishandled." The admission seemed to cost him something. "The Army acknowledges its error." Sheriff Davies nodded. "Then I believe we have a man to release." They brought Elliot in, still in irons. Hale stepped forward, keys in hand. The chains clinked as they fell away, a sound that echoed in the quiet hall. "Mr. Crane," Hale said stiffly, "you have my personal apology." And he turned to where Kavi stood near the wall. "The Army's thanks to you, Scout, for preserving the truth of that day." Kavi inclined his head slightly, his dignity making the gesture seem like a gift bestowed rather than deference given. A commotion at the back of the hall drew all eyes. Mrs. Brinker pushed her way forward, her face flushed. She had clearly noticed the mood of the crowd shifting away from her previous accusations. "Well then," she announced, voice carrying, "if he's such an upstanding citizen, he can pay damages for my reputation. All this trouble has cost me custom at my boarding house, and my own daughter turned against me." "That's enough." Preacher Lyle's quiet voice cut through her theatrics. He addressed the gathered townspeople. "We've seen truth revealed today. Let's remember mercy, as we hope to receive it ourselves." Elliot stepped forward. "I ask nothing for myself, only that Hallie be released from her mother's claim. She's of age to make her own choice." The sheriff nodded, pulling a sheet of paper from his desk. "A simple legal acknowledgement will suffice." He dipped his pen and began to write in careful script. "Declaring Hallie Brinker a free woman of legal age, able to make her own decisions regarding residence, marriage, and property." Mrs. Brinker started to protest, but the sheriff's stern look silenced her. "Sign here, Mrs. Brinker, or we can discuss certain trading licenses and tax matters instead." She signed with an angry flourish. Lyle added his signature as witness, then handed the paper to Hallie. Her fingers trembled slightly as she took it, but her voice was steady. "Thank you." As twilight painted the sky purple outside the windows, the tension in the hall began to ease. Several churchwomen appeared with kettles of stew and baskets of fresh bread. The warm smell filled the room as people began to talk in low voices, the typical evening hum of the town returning. Elliot stood with Hallie near the stove, its heat warming away the last of the jail's chill. Kavi joined them briefly, touching his chest in a gesture of respect, before slipping away into the gathering dusk. Lyle moved among the townspeople, his quiet words encouraging forgiveness rather than judgment. The sheriff watched it all with satisfaction, tucking the signed paper safely into his record book. Another page of the town's story completed, justice served, and peace restored as night drew its gentle curtain over the day's drama. The sun rose golden over frost-rimed hills, painting the church windows with amber light. Inside the sanctuary, oil lamps still flickered as townspeople filed in, filling the wooden pews. Their breath made soft clouds in the cool morning air. Preacher Lyle stood at the altar, his Bible open to the marriage passages. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of relief and joy. "Dearly beloved, we gather to witness these two souls join in holy matrimony." Elliot and Hallie faced each other before him. Elliot's clean-pressed shirt couldn't hide the marks of his jail stay, but his eyes shone clear and steady. Hallie wore her new gray wool shawl, her cheeks pink with happiness. Their vows rang true in the hushed sanctuary. I promise to honor and protect you, Elliot spoke, his deep voice gentle. Hallie's response came clear and strong. I promise to build and bless our home together. Kavi stood as witness, his bearing dignified in his scout's jacket. Beside him, old Thad Jessup grinned beneath his frost-dusted beard, having ridden in at dawn after spotting Kavi's smoke signal rising from the ridge. The congregation raised their voices in hymn, the notes carrying healing after the week's tensions. Amazing grace filled every corner of the sanctuary, binding the community together again. Afterward, they shared a simple celebration. Coffee steamed in tin cups, dried apple pies, and beans filled wooden bowls. Elliot quietly sold a small pouch of gold dust to the mercantile owner. With the money, he purchased new boots and school slates, distributing them among the town orphans and Ute children who had drifted in seeking winter shelter. When spring comes, Elliot announced, we will build a mountain school near our cabin. All children welcome. He kept the remaining gold secure for that purpose. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Elliot and Hallie loaded supplies into their saddlebags. Snow clouds gathered dark on the horizon, promising weather. They would spend one more night in town, with Kavi agreeing to escort them partway home tomorrow, when they began their journey as husband and wife. Morning dawned with a gentle snowfall, flakes drifting like feathers from a pearl-gray sky. Elliot, Hallie, and Kavi set out from town at an easy walk, their horses' hooves crunching softly in the fresh powder. The pack mule plodded behind, laden with their supplies and wedding gifts. By mid-morning they paused in a sheltered grove. Elliot noticed Hallie's shawl slipping and helped her adjust it, his touch gentle despite his weathered hands. Kavi gathered dry twigs and soon had a small fire crackling, offering welcome warmth to their cold fingers. The shelf in the springhouse needs widening, Elliot mused, warming his hands. For preserves come summer. Hallie nodded, already planning. That old stump near the door would make a fine reading bench for the children. Good thinking, Kavi said. Many young ones eager to learn your ways. When the sun reached its peak, they arrived at the ridge where their paths would split. Kavi reined his horse eastward. 2 boys ask already about school, he said. When snow melts, I send them. They want to learn letters, carving too. After farewell gestures, Elliot and Hallie descended into familiar timber. The afternoon light filtered through snow-laden branches as they approached home. Smoke soon rose from their cabin's chimney, curling against the winter sky. Inside, Hallie unpacked flour and carefully stacked the new slates, while Elliot checked the meat hanging from the pole outside. Their wedding supper was simple but precious: hot stew, fresh cornbread, and a final slice of pie from town, graced with a single candle. After evening prayers, they sat close by the fire, speaking softly of their dreams. No guns inside, Elliot said firmly, thinking of the children who would come. And boots off at the door, Hallie added with a smile. Keep the floor clean for reading circles. They fell quiet then, watching the flames dance, marveling at the mercy that had brought them together and given their solitude such purpose. 7 days passed in gentle rhythm at the mountain cabin. Each morning brought familiar chores, Elliot splitting wood, while Hallie kneaded bread, both of them tending the animals and checking snares. Mid-week, a mild storm dusted the peaks with fresh powder, leaving behind air crisp as new, apples. Thad Jessup shambled by with a string of rainbow trout, sharing coffee and news of valley folk interested in sending their young ones to learn. The morning of the school's first day dawned clear and cold. 6 small pine stools, lovingly carved by Elliot's patient hands, stood in a half-circle near the hearth. Hallie had spent evenings cutting an old quilt into cushions, stitching them neat and tight so no child would sit uncomfortable on bare wood. Just after sunrise, Kavi appeared through the trees, leading 2 Ute boys bundled in wool blankets. Behind them trudged Sarah Miller, a miner's orphaned niece, her copper hair bright against the snow. The children's breaths made little clouds in the frozen air. Hallie stepped onto the porch, her heart full. "Welcome, Thomas." "Welcome, Joseph," she said to the Ute boys, using their agency names with care. "And Sarah, dear one, come in where it's warm." Inside, steam rose from cups of warm milk sweetened with the last of their molasses. Fresh bread, still hot from the morning baking, sat ready on a plank table. The children ate slowly, eyes wide at the cabin's tidy comfort. "Now then," Hallie said when the cups were empty. She demonstrated how to clean their new slates with a wool scrap, then showed them letters traced in fine ash. "This is A for apple," she explained, helping small fingers copy the shape. Near the woodpile, Elliot gathered the boys for their first lesson in carving. He chose soft pine pieces, showing how to shape a sparrow's wings and tail. "A knife is like a letter," he told them gravely. "It makes meaning, not mischief. We use tools to build, not break." At noon, they all bowed heads as Elliot prayed. "Lord, we thank you for protection through storm and doubt. Grant us wisdom to teach these little ones your ways. Amen." The afternoon brought play in the packed snow, children's laughter ringing against the mountainside. Hallie watched from the doorway, one hand pressed to her middle, as Elliot carried something from the workshop, a cradle carved from baby cedar, its rockers smooth as river stones. Their eyes met across the yard, hers filling with tears of joy and possibility. "It needs a bit more sanding," Elliot said softly when he reached her. "But I reckon it'll serve when the time comes." As the sun sank behind the peaks, parents arrived to collect their young. Kavi led his charges back toward the agency cabin, both boys clutching their carved sparrows. Sarah's uncle, still in mining clothes, thanked them gruffly, his rough hand gentle on his niece's shoulder. Elliot and Hallie stood together on the porch after all had gone, watching lamplight spill across new-fallen snow. The evening was hushed except for the whisper of wind in the pines. God's breath, Hallie thought, blessing their beginning. "The Lord bought us back for more than gold," Elliot murmured, his arm warm around her shoulders. Hallie leaned into his strength, remembering that first fearful night when she'd left town with a stranger. Now she stood beside her husband, their cabin bright with purpose. "And we'll spend it on souls," she answered softly, watching the last light fade from the winter sky. Inside, the new slates waited for tomorrow's lessons, and the cedar cradle rocked gently in the hearth-lit shadows, promising more love yet to come. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.